everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, why they work, and why we love them. I'm your host, Mark, and with me is Craig.
Yo.
And today we wanted to talk a little bit about a genre that is probably as big as MOBAs, if not just under that, in terms of player base and popularity, and that is MMORPGs.
The classics.
Yeah, I guess it's funny how long some of the MMOs have stuck around, and that's actually one of the things we talk about. So they feel like classics, even though there's also like an active development happening on games like World of Warcraft.
And relatively speaking, they're a new genre, right? I mean, they can only come about with the internet being widespread, high-speed internet in large part. So, all things considered, they're actually kind of young for the gaming world, so maybe not the classic. They're just so huge, and they dominated such a big era of my gaming life, at least, that I think of them as this huge, just kind of looming titan in the background. I don't play many of them, so they're kind of this otherness to me.
Well, it's a genre that frankly, it's fraught with problems, and really cool things that you can do only in an MMO. Like giant raid encounters or just like map battles that happen organically. There's a lot of cool things that can happen in an MMO, but there also are just a lot of tensions to balance when you have that many people in a world, and a lot of things that can become unbalanced or just not quite feel right for the player.
And far be it from us to leave any of those things out. We will get to the good stuff.
Yes.
Because there are a lot of, I think, really, really fantastic and beautiful things about MMOs, that, like Mark said, that are unique and can't be done other places and succeed well. And there's a reason the genre succeeded so well.
Right.
But we'll start off with our own unique brand of dismantling and analyzing, picking apart different aspects of MMOs.
Well, one distinction that people often draw when talking about MMORPGs is the idea of a theme park versus a sandbox. And I'll go ahead and explain what those are. A theme park is generally a game where it's on rails, quote unquote. It's like you're on a roller coaster. You go from one area to the next. You're experiencing the game clearly as the developers intended for you to. There's usually maybe a queer set of quest lines. I don't know. I mean, there's probably some very progressive quest lines out there, but there are clear quest lines. There are obvious instances and raids and dungeons that you should go to that are appropriate for your level. And the game pretty much takes you by the hand through the experience the developers created. This is as opposed to a sandbox where there is a framework, a set of rules for how the world runs, just sort of like, we have the laws of nations here or the laws of physics here. But other than that, the players are given autonomy. And obviously, this is going to be on a spectrum. There are degrees of freedom that different MMOs offer. I would say World of Warcraft falls heavily on the theme park side, and a game like Eve is going to fall really far on the sandbox side. And there are games in between those two.
For sure. And in large part, and we're not going to go into this too much because this has been written about probably far better than Mark or I could explain organically, but in large part, this distinction actually didn't quite exist before World of Warcraft launched in 2004. MMOs were still super young at that point. EverQuest was, kind of the go-to when people thought about MMOs, and they're still very ill-defined. And in large part, WoW kind of defined what we think of as modern MMOs. And people used to talk about WoW clones. Now they just call them MMOs.
Yeah, it's funny how that works.
In terms of just even the way the combat works, exploration, experience, gearing, dungeons, raids, all that jazz. That's all kind of very much WoW centric. They didn't invent those things by any means, but they definitely made it super mainstream, as Blizzard tends to do. So it's an interesting distinction that people kind of only start separating out that degree of freedom from sandbox to theme park. True MMO like purists will kind of deride World of Warcraft as an MMO, actually, because they kind of harken back to the age where sandbox, the idea of MMOs were unique in just their amount of freedom and player interaction that you could have there.
Right.
And so, in large part, that theme park sandbox dynamic has only really become a thing since, it's been 15 years now almost, but since WoW launched in 2004,
Mm-hmm.
I think. So that's an interesting thing that even just this dynamic we're talking about was in large part WoW's fault.
Right. Yeah.
It's pretty hard to underestimate the amount of influence that World of Warcraft had on this genre.
And there are so many angry people on the internet who have derided WoW and just the state of MMOs, um, talking
Yeah,
about how it's to take you by the hand and lead you through the game. It's just looking for yellow exclamation points and then
right.
following your mini map to the next set of
Yeah,
monsters to slay.
and that's pretty legit. It's also pretty crazy too that you had. I mean, what was WoW's peak? I think Wrath of the Lich King was like it was either 12 or 14 million people,
Hmm.
which is, I mean, one that's absolutely just blows any other MMO's numbers out of the water, just at least by double like any other peak game. But two, this just I mean, just an incredible amount of concurrent players for anything. Um, so it obviously it worked, right? There was something unbelievably powerful about the draw, and we can get into that. We'll eventually talk about my favorite thing in general is just storytelling and narrative, and particularly in video games. And MMOs are a fascinating beast to talk about with narrative, and WoW in particular. And I can would imagine that a large part of success was obviously the playing off of the Warcraft franchise that at that point was massive. The success of Warcraft 3 and Frozen Throne was huge, not just as a game, um, but as a setting. I mean, it was pretty much the most success. It was pretty much D&D brought into mainstream gaming, um, better than D&D did. So it's kind of the most successful of all the fantasy archetypes there, and the narrative was super strong. Even outside of the fantasy part, that was just appealing to people. Um, the narrative was fantastic. The amount of characters and the ups and downs and the world building was just really good. So giving people not only a chance to continue in that, but actually be in the world was like huge. I think that was the big draw there. I mean, it was Blizzard's fan base, and then continued by polishing a really really good MMO.
One of the things classically done in World of Warcraft style games, and actually most MMOs do this, is they offer quests to players. Now, the yellow exclamation point was an innovation of World of Warcraft, but most games have quests of some sort. And these present an interesting problem because you want the player to feel like they're participating in important events in the world around them. Otherwise, it just feels tedious, right? Nobody wants to go kill 12 pigs and return their intestines to the apothecary just because, like, right? It's like, oh, I'm a vendor and I need supplies and I have no supplier. Why don't you do it? It's like, what kind of an operation are you
Yeah,
running, buddy, where you don't have a supplier? You got to recruit random people off to kill your
yeah, right.
boars. But
Oh, totally. And that'll yeah, I'll get there in a second when you talk about like main characters giving you a quest to kill the main
yeah,
bad guy, and you're like,
exactly.
what the hell are you doing? Like last game, like in the anyway,
Yeah,
I'll get there in a
you
second.
see this like this question mark leveled character. They're asking you to do their dirty work, and you're like, wait, what? So a lot of these quests, I mean, there's already been so much discussion on quest design, but they boil down to very simple errand quests or maybe an escort quest, a collection quests. Like they follow some pretty standard templates for the most part, and some of this is, I guess, lazily introducing more quests because it probably, I would imagine, they start with a few core quests that they're like, this is important for understanding the story of the game, and then they just add in more because it's things for the players to do while they're leveling. It kind of goes with the theme part. The rails are sort of the quests in most of these games. I don't think it has to be that way, but the current paradigm is that the thing that keeps you on track in the game are the
Mhm.
quests that you're doing.
Yeah,
Um, and
tell you exactly where to go and what to do.
Exactly. And so necessarily, you got to have a lot of them, right? Because you've got to have quests to guide you through the content and a lot of hours of play, and especially at the lower levels. Um, but narratively, this creates all sorts of problems. And Greg, I'll hand it over to you to talk about
I'm sure.
that.
I mean, yeah, there's something kind of crazy about the idea of having, and this even changed since MMOs or even since Vanilla WoW came out, but now in large part, whenever you get a quest, it'll tell you exactly where to go and exactly what to do to get that. And many times, actually, just mark it on your map, and you can just go straight over
Right.
there. And it'll flag the trash that you have to kill, and it's very, very streamlined. It didn't used to be that way. A lot of times there actually be some semblance of and that's even more theme parky. Like questing can be, not necessarily theme parky. I think it's easier to be that way. But in theory, you could
Right.
have quests where the quest giver will tell you that, hey, this needs to get done, and I don't really know how to do it. So can you go explore and figure out ways to do this? And then you find this item, and you read the description, and you're like, hey, this might work. And you combine it with other stuff, and kind of like some small puzzle, kind of exploration. That's more sandboxy, and I think that is what questing used to look like back in the day.
Yeah.
Now it is definitely very much just the mode to one, convey story, and two, to level you basically before you get to end game content. It's something to do before you start doing the really heavy PvE stuff. And the interesting thing with just MMOs in general, and I have the only thing I've played at any length, and it's very short. I think I've only played like 2 months worth of World of Warcraft. Um, I actually played and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit later, but I played a really lesser known game that ended up failing called Warhammer Online, actually, Age of Reckoning. But point is, Warcraft is I'm pretty darn familiar with that. I played a ton of Warcraft 3 when it came out, and really loved that lore. But the point is, with narrative telling in MMOs, you go from a point where you there's two conflicting things that the developers want and the players want, which is, as a character in a game, you want to be feeling. We talk all the time about the fantasy of feeling powerful, the fantasy of being special, being something in the world that is unique, and you are the person that all these we talk about all the NPCs come to, and they want stuff from you, and you're the one who's able to achieve it, and that feels good and feels unique. The problem with that is one, outside of just the natural danger of Mary Sue-ness and narrative. But two, you in an MMO, you're sharing the world with everyone else who's perfectly unique, right? So there's some level of just difficulty of immersion you just have to kind of force down, is the fact that there are tons and tons of people who are doing the exact same thing as you. So that's difficult. But two, the fact that you as a player have an attempt to give the player complete control over what they do, and the way they do it, which is also kind of laughable in theme park because it's pretty hard to do that. You just kind of go along with the quests. But
right,
the player character itself can't have any narrative function, basically, other than that which is given to it by NPCs and events happening in the world. So you as a character, you have no arc, you have no growth, you have no ability to, one, you can't fail, which is really, really difficult because that's like how conflict and story is bred. As well as you have no ability to speak into anything. You have no actual agency in the world. And yet you have to be the most important character. You have to be at the center of all of this, because you as a character, as a player, especially with World of Warcraft, you have all these great characters that got built up over the years that players loved so much, and a huge draw of WoW was getting to inhabit this world and getting to see these characters and get to experience them in this unique sense with a character that doesn't exist, that is just you, that you've got to make. That's huge. But like I said, if all of those interactions are coming through this filter of I am unique, but I can't do anything, then suddenly you axe all of these really important character design, or at least character personality things, where because you're the one who has to be doing stuff, the NPCs, the characters who were used to have been doing stuff in the other games, they can't really do anything anymore. They have to have you do it or do it with you. And then if they do it with you, that's a whole other set of problems, because then players complain about feeling like they're being babied, or they don't have enough agency. So there's this push and pull between players wanting agency and the ability to define stuff and feel special, but that being just a death sentence to any traditional narrative.
you give the player all this power, and I think this happens in a lot of games, not just MMOs. But you give the game, you give the players lots of like power, and you make them feel like the hero. But there's also a stark lack of autonomy, because
Totally.
like this super powerful hero who's going to save us can't choose to do anything else. Like
Totally.
he has to.
And that's not necessarily a problem in traditional single player games, right? Because that's part of the contract you sign as a player when you buy it, is that all you're getting
Right.
is exactly what the developer gives you. An MMO, especially like I said earlier on, I think that's why people have gotten angry about it, is that one of the big huge draws of it was in fact the amount of choice you had. And that's been tried to be retained slightly through the years of like, yeah, no, it's still an MMO. You still get to do stuff however you want it. But at the end of the day, with kind of the advent and the dominance of these very on the rail gameplay types, and especially like I said, when you're trying to tell a story with characters, and it's really rough. Any villain gets reduced to a raid boss that you're going to be able to defeat. It also makes it really hard to give any weight to villains because inevitably you're going to beat them as a player and not with other people. With actual characters. So
Right.
like longstanding, that was one thing I really had a hard time with again, that huge the top of World of Warcraft was during an expansion called the Frozen Throne, which brought back probably the most popular character from the Warcraft 3 era, Arthas, the Lich King, and I think that's a big part of why it's so popular, because everyone wanted to see what's going to happen with that story, because there's a huge cliffhanger at the end of Warcraft 3, and basically what happened, right, is we eventually beat him, right, the player does, right. And that's such a horrible way to end that story arc in some ways, because we weren't a thing at all in all of the character development made us care about Arthas in the first place.
Right.
We're the ones that get to finally bring the closure to that. We're the ones that brought the whole campaign, and of course, like I said, that's really important. That's so cool for a player who got to play the early Warcraft games and then get to come and be a part of this narrative. You get to put yourself into it. But again, narratively, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. There's no closure there. There's no weight. There's no movement, because who the heck are we to him? And they tried to work around that, and to varying levels of degrees, depending on who you ask. But that's not the way that story it's not a satisfying conclusion.
No, I mean, imagine like your favorite fantasy novel, and except for the ending where they kill the villain, just some random dude shows up and kills them. Like,
right, in large part.
Instead of the characters you got to know, it was just some townsperson who showed up with a sword and stabbed him. It's like, what?
I mean, kind of, it'd be equivalent of like, yeah, this weird like J.K. Rowling releasing the seventh Harry Potter as this choose your own adventure sort of thing, where the reader gets to choose how Voldemort gets defeated. Like, yeah. There's no like all the power and narrative weight of Harry's sacrifice and all that jazz in the final moments gets, or even if someone did that with Harry, right? Like even Harry was there, and that's like that helps, but you have to be there too, and it's like it just kills it,
Yeah, it turns it almost into it turns that what should be the climax of the story into a gimmick. Because you get to pick, the climax is such an important part of the story. Like, I could see maybe getting away with a choose your own falling action, but like choosing how the story resolves is like it's almost like that changes the whole story.
Yeah, very much so. So anyway, that's just a brief kind of rant on particularly the Warcraft narrative, but that's a huge danger across the board for MMOs. Is like I said, this weird. I mean, it's another problem with Diablo 3. It's a very similar thing there. Where your character doesn't interact with anything, and so all the character movement has to come from NPCs, but you're also the most important character. It's just a really weird, difficult thing to manage. I don't know what the solution to that is necessarily. And it sucks because, like I said, I cared so much about the Warcraft lore and have just had to watch it get, in my mind, pretty butchered in large part. A lot of the characters are pretty unrecognizable. And
I think theme park, as we're talking, it becomes a better and better description for what you see in a game like World of Warcraft. Like, imagine going to Disney World and thinking you were going to learn more about Goofy's background by eating at the Goofy Cafe, or like going to some Goofy themed ride. Like, it's not going to expand the story or the character of Goofy. You just sort of like get to engage with content that's themed around Goofy.
Yeah, that's a good point, because in a theme park, the primary thing is you, right? Your experience of it, and how you in a book or a novel or a movie, you are completely a passive viewer. You're not engaging with the tale at all,
Right.
And so hence there's a lot of ability for the author, a good author, to be able to write, exactly what they're trying to convey. So it's really hard. Like I maintain, and maybe a final side note here. Another one very often cited success of storytelling in MMOs is SWTOR, right? Star Wars: The Old Republic Online, which was made basically in imitation of the Old Republic games, Knights of the Old Republic,
right?
Which are considered some of the finest Star Wars games and RPGs out there. Period, particularly for the story. And there's a slight irony there in that SWTOR is, as an MMO, not doing too hot, really. It's pretty low in terms of player base, and the content releases have been pretty patchy, actually, in terms of the amount of content. And so by a lot of normal MMO standards, not that great. But like I said, it still is kind of held up as a paragon, rather, of storytelling MMOs, which is kind of hilarious to me because I think the reason it did that was that it sacrificed a lot of very MMO-y things, like, kind of a lot of freedom to choose and a lot of ability to kind of customize your own character and make you feel like you're your own thing, by basically replacing it with a whole lot of really good single player RPG storytelling dynamics, which was basically the leveling system. Problem with that is once you finish the levels and you get to endgame, the endgame kind of sucked and didn't keep anyone around. So the very thing that made it a good story was actually because it wasn't very MMO-y.
Right.
Which, I don't know if I'm just totally confirming my own point here, kind of blindly. But to me, it seems like a decent piece of evidence to conclude that MMOs are not very good storytelling. The best storytelling MMO is the least MMO-y MMO.
It was unsatisfying in the end game specifically because it was focused on story. And once the story ends, it's like, well, that's the end of the story.
Precisely. Yeah, exactly. And people talked about that.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the contrast, the other side, which is some developers have decided to solve this problem, or maybe have accidentally solved it, by creating a sandbox type game, where it wasn't really created with a story in mind, with a overarching narrative. There's still going to be NPCs. They're still going to have interesting things to talk about, but there isn't an idea of you're part of some grand thing happening in this world.
Yeah, the idea is that you are actually quite average in some ways in a sandbox RPG. You're just another one of the dudes.
Right.
You're not necessarily the savior of the world, to an extent, and you can play a part. I think a good sandbox tends to do a lot of world building as opposed to like narration. A whole lot of setting, a whole lot of ambiance, but then you actually can decide what you do with it.
Yeah, and I think that avoids most of the problems associated with the narrative, because you just don't really have a narrative. Or the stories that happen in the game really do come from players being important. Like, if you have a very powerful player who's invested a lot of time in the game in a sandbox world, that's what they are. They really are an important, powerful player.
Right.
They didn't have that thrust upon them just because they made an account and now you're going to be the hero of Azeroth.
Right, and you got to level through everything, and suddenly, you're WoW's current expansion has you actually becoming whatever class you are. You become the actual canonical leader of your class in the world. So you're like, if you're a paladin, you're like the high lord of all paladins in the world. And everyone recognizes you as such. And that's just anyway. Point is, so you're absolutely right in terms of that. Like, if you are remarkable in a sandbox, it's because you actually became remarkable, right? Like the classic one that we keep on talking about is Eve Online. I'm just gonna share briefly a couple of my favorite stories that again sound like a better story than has been written in some MMOs, and it happened just naturally. Which two of them I'll just briefly touch on. One of which is basically, this one's more funny to me. It's basically a really successful Ponzi scheme. The big huge thing in Eve tends to be kind of economy. People kind of call it like an MMO spreadsheet generator because there's so much data that comes through and it's really complicated and really deep. So the people who are into it really love it. But there's this one dude who, in large part, he basically set up a bank and he accepted money from people and had it, had managed people's money, paid out, loans, all that jazz, the way banks make money. And the great part was, in the real world, banks have serious consequences, a lot of regulations on you if they just walk away with your money, right, or they lose your money. And Eve is notoriously ungoverned, even by the devs. And so this dude literally, he ran this bank for like 3 months, got like a legitimate fortune, and then just walked away with it. He just like took it, and I think he bought like one of the most expensive ships and just just ran. And there's nothing, like, everyone just lost their mind because it literally just given it to him on this weird little real world social contact of that's how banks work. But he had no rules on him, so he just left, and that like disrupted the economy in that sector. It was fantastic. So that's sort of like, and there's all the stories that came from that. And the other one is like a legitimate like political like drama in which there's, in short, there's sectors that you can actually capture, sectors of the game world as a alliance of players, and if you hold it for long enough, you establish what's called sovereignty, and sovereignty allows you to set up tons of defenses and orbital defenses and satellites, and you can block warp jumps and all that jazz. It's really important to maintain sovereignty. And basically, there were these two warring factions, the two biggest alliances in the game, and it had been ongoing. And the way that they ended up breaking the stalemate was a top official from one of the two factions basically secretly defected to the other one. And what he did is he allowed, on a really specific time, he was the one in charge of paying all the sovereignty fees. Basically, you have to pay money to make sure that you maintain sovereignty in a sector. And so what he did was he aligned this up with the other faction. And this went on like, this is it sounds really simple when I explain it, but this is like a very involved process that they had to do to make this work. And what he did was he basically let the sovereignty lapse at this really specific time. And so the entire front that had been contested for like months in this war, they actually call it the Great War of the Online. This is back in like 2010 or something like that. He let it lapse entirely. And so everything became neutral. And the other alliance moved in and caught everything by surprise and basically took over over the game universe had ended the war, basically. And all the political, all the ramifications that came from that. I think he disbanded. I think he entirely, maybe this is a separate one. There's another one where one of the top dudes defected, disbanded his entire alliance and had the other alliance steal up the name so they couldn't even reband again. Anyway, point is, it's stuff like that, which is like hugely complex and like a great story that happened entirely organically. It's just a bunch of people coming up with, there's like zero developer oversight.
Right, and there you have story emerging from player dynamics. Like you didn't have to write that, and it's still totally. It's an interesting story. Like
it's really like go look these up too. I give you really bare bones. It's funny, people have written them kind of as narratives, kind of almost in universe, and they're really fun to read. Like it actually it reads like a political space drama.
We'll put a link to that on the Facebook, and that way people can read that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have those.
What an interesting idea to reward players who invest in a world with story, right? Because if you aren't invested in the world, you're not going to be part of these big corporations where things are happening. You're not going to be a political power. But if you do invest, then you're rewarded with having influence, having a say that you've earned, instead of just sort of having this veneer of having become something really important when all you did was, grind out the same quests that every other person on the server has played.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's, I think that's, again, like talking about MMO purists, I think that's what they consider true MMOs. The point of a massively multiplayer experience that's what makes it unique from a single player RPG, right? In their minds, there's nothing a theme park MMO could offer that a really well crafted single player RPG couldn't do better, basically. That's arguable for sure in terms of all the systems and the ability to do two different things and be different things. It's very, with a single player RPG, particularly, you can think of Skyrim, right? That's kind of held up as a exemplar of its genre. In large part, the reason people love Skyrim is the breadth of things to do, the choice that's inherent in it, the really, really crisp combat, the leveling options, and then the story that you get to be a part of. And those are all things that people tend to talk about World of Warcraft with as well. Maybe not the combat, that's pretty simple MMO combat, but in large part, that idea of those are the things that people look for in a role-playing game, that seems to be pretty consistent across the board. And of course, with WoW, you have other things, particularly, obviously, the social aspect with guilds and a lot of the really cool things that can happen there. But as a game, that's really, really similar stuff.
You kind of split out the social network part of it versus the actual game part. The single-player RPG, I agree, most single-player RPGs would fare better than just a WoW clone if you were playing it alone.
In theory, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So, so there's something you were talking about in terms of, we kind of talked about like the leveling process, but then there's there's a thing called endgame, right, in MMOs, which means you've gone through all the levels, you've maxed out, it tends to be where other games end, actually, where you've reached a max level, and you've probably beaten, the story bosses, or gotten a whole lot of the story via the leveling quests. Usually there'll be a small amount of story locked away behind raids, and game content, but usually not too much. And, but because it's MMO and you're paying money, odds are, for it, the top 5 MMOs, I think 4 of them have subs now, subscription-based models, there's got to be more to do. So what do you do? And what do you as a developer try to put to put in? How do you keep people happy? How do you maintain players?
There's a number of ways that developers, I think, classically try to retain players, um, and I think all of that. Well, most of them can end up feeling kind of tedious, but inevitably you end up with people at the end of the game on a theme park game because what you've done is just hand people content the whole time. That really is the game. And so when you run out of content, the only thing left for the player to do uh, is to either try to make a world that is not designed to be very sandboxy into a sandbox, um, or
Right. Is it called role
right,
play
yeah. So you
servers?
could start role play servers. You could maybe like re-roll a character and just sort of play through the theme park again, kind of like going to Disney World for the second
Hmm.
time. A lot of the stuff's going to be
Right.
familiar, but hey, it was fun the first time. Um,
Right.
o- right, yeah,
Alts.
alts. I guess a game like World of Warcraft, there's going to be a lot of um, raiding or end game content, right? And so the increase in difficulty can
Hmm.
come, or the added content can come from increasing the difficulty of those raid encounters, giving the players more items to collect. Um,
Hmm.
and if you need to keep a player occupied for longer, as a developer, that's actually pretty easy, right? Why don't you decrease some drop rates? There you go. It's harder to get this item. Why don't you make it harder to gain reputation for this particular faction? But the thing is, a lot of those things aren't very satisfying, and it's not really why people are playing a theme park game, right? Presumably, they're playing a theme park game because they want more
Hmm.
theme park. But much like a real theme
Right.
park, you can't. Disney World can't add a new attraction every month or even every 6 months. Like it would be an incredible burden on the
Right.
park to be able to do that. And to their credit, they
Right.
actually do add things all the time. But they've, you
Right.
know, they've and maybe MMOs can actually learn from some of what Disney World does. But they've come up with other ways to keep the park fresh by having events and having parades and having seasonal things that happen. And some of those things do come
Hmm.
up now in MMOs, but
Yeah, for sure.
inevitably the developers can't
Seasonally.
keep up with the demand for the players to have content.
So much easier to. I mean, you said this, but it's such there's such a difference, both resource as well as just ease of consuming content
Right.
versus creating it. Right. It's a ridiculous amount of work that has to go into creating really really fine content. Which, to be fair, the type of content that they do, I mean, WoW does there's a reason that they're at the top, man. Blizzard's good at what they do. It's really good content. It's just there's no possible way to keep up
Right.
with player demand.
Even in a studio as big as Blizzard, you can't keep up with the player demand. You've got people who are paying for your game. If you think about $15 a month for a game, within 4 months, that's a full retail price of a AAA title. Like that is a lot of
Yeah.
content that players are paying for that they're not going to see because nobody has a 6 month turnaround or a 4 month turnaround for a full game.
Right.
Like it's not going to
That's
happen.
obscene. And obviously, there's some added value, right? I mean, you're not just playing for the straight content. Maybe it's more like $10. Like you're playing for the ability to interact socially as well. That's a huge part of it. And like we've been ragging on WoW a little bit, but there is a huge level of social interaction for a lot of people, and and I think we'll get to that in a little bit too. The importance of not underestimating that. And how much value that it has. But yeah, there's a level. If you pay $15 a month out, then you have just paid $60. And in terms of the amount of, even just think about hours, right? A lot of people talk about that now, like number of hours of content you get for the amount of money you spend. Um, like 60, like in theory, again, with a big AAA game, $60, maybe it's not always true, but that should be able to buy you a frick ton of entertainment. Um,
Right.
if it's a good game, probably at least in the high dozens, if not hundreds of hours, hopefully. Um, and that's just really hard to replicate in an MMO without, like you said, kind of some of these really easy things like just difficulty scaling. That's a classic one. We talked about that a
Right.
ton last week, obviously. But having the same raids, just harder. There's like four types of difficulties that you can do, and each one has a higher drop rate or different gear that you can get. And sometimes, very rarely, you'll have a slightly different story experience, but that's super rare. It tends to be like the very very end raid of an entire expansion. So that sort of thing is very. I mean, it's very difficult and very hard um, to keep players around, basically. And various MMOs have different ways of dealing with it. WoW has added to their credit, has added a lot of different features. They have basically put Pokemon in the game in terms of pet battles, where you can find little animals and different creatures and train them, and then fight your pets who have a select set of moves and a damage type associated with them against other pets. And so you can do that. You can farm for legendary, or not legendaries, but cool mounts. Mount collecting is a big thing in WoW. Professionally, you can play the auction house. You can do some slight economy stuff, marketplace stuff, where you can use your professions, which are kind of gathering and crafting professions, and do that. But past that, I mean, there's things to do. But in large part, I think the key difference that I see, at least, is like, even talking about Eve, there like is no end game for that. You can have a goal for sure, but there's end game doesn't really exist. There's some level of like, yeah, you have to get into the nullsec, which is just a place where there's no more rules, just to help players get by in some of the early levels. There's like these NPC policemen basically that'll stop you from getting killed. But once you get past that, that's pretty much where the game starts. There is no real end game. There's just
Right.
playing the game.
It's so interesting what you said about like that's where the game starts. Like it's almost like that zone in the beginning is just sort of like, okay, we'll put you on rails for a little bit, or we'll give you some protection in the beginning via this police force. But once you get to know the game, we're going to remove more and more structure until you're in nullsec and you can do whatever you want, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Yeah. Exactly. No, you're precisely right. It scales back the amount of handholding the more you play, as opposed to.
I would say that theme parks actually have the opposite experience because okay, of course you start in your newbie zone, but as a newbie you can go almost anywhere and have a challenge and have a quest and have something interesting to do.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to level.
But once you're the top highest level, there are so many maps and areas that are uninteresting to you because
the majority of the gameplay, right, is now irrelevant to you.
Most of these quests give you items that are crap. Most of these enemies are 15, 20, 40 levels beneath you. There's just so many places where you don't need or want to go.
Yeah, you've managed to lock out most of the world, actually, which is insane, especially for MMO, where the idea of it, hopefully a part of it, would be the idea that you get to go and explore and see all these different things and get to do things the way you want. This veneer of control over your fate and what you do, as opposed to feeling you actually, you're right. At the end game, you tend to actually be very narrowly confined to doing a set number of things.
Right, now you raid. That's what you do. Or now you PvP.
It's very interesting too, right? That's another thing we haven't really talked about too much. Eve doesn't really have PvE per se. It's all PvP, right? At that point, it's all players against players. PvP in most other games tends to be, at least in WoW, and I think in some others, it's like, at least. So the other big MMOs, right? It would be like Final Fantasy 14. I think Elder Scrolls Online has done all right for itself.
Yeah, it's doing better too with the release of Morrowind.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah, they had Morrowind. Some other ones. I mean, yeah, like I said, SWTOR kind of fizzled out. ArcAge, not so much. Guild Wars 2 still doing pretty well. Maybe not as well as some of the others, but anyway, point is, in all of that, I think a big part of PvP tends to be just a kind of arena-esque, you fight other players, right?
Right.
And that game is also a very entirely different thing. Like, even with Warcraft, is an entirely different gear set, right? You can't even use PvE gear in PvP because it's entirely different. It kind of splits the player base a little bit. And of course, there's people that do both, but at some level, if you really want to be good at one, you kind of have to focus on one of them. So it's another fascinating thing that, again, it's not a. It feels a lot less like choice and just you can do one of these kind of two things almost.
Right.
And then you're kind of stuck in them. Yeah. There's like one way to do PvP, and it's arenas basically. Battlegrounds, I guess you can do ranked battlegrounds, but in terms of like actual, people that are in endgame level, they pretty much just push arenas, which is just 5v5 combat.
And so you get put more and more on rails as you go in a theme park because.
At least, wow.
Well, I think even fundamentally to the game design, they have to preserve the world and the theme park for the lower level players. It's not like you can just get to the high level and then they're like, okay, now you can, destroy a town if you want. Because little Jimmy, who's still leveling up to that content, needs the town to be around because that's part of the theme park.
Totally. Yeah,
And so
exactly.
you can't just give the high level players free reign over your world. You can't
Right.
take rails away for the high level players,
Yeah.
because it would cease to make sense for the lower level players.
I mean, what do you think? So, we've talked a fair bit about the things that don't seem to work as well with MMOs, or at least the theme park design.
Hmm.
What are some? I mean, so one thing that we got caught on a little bit when we were talking about the show was what, why, why is it so compelling, and why do so many people go to it?
Right.
If a lot of this stuff is true, it's kind of this weird little grind sort of thing, and single player RPGs can do a lot of the stuff better, and yada yada yada. And I think one of the conclusions I came up with the least was I've done it. It's weird. I don't play MMOs, but I read a lot about them because I find them fascinating. Um, and one thing that I do envy a bit, and I think we really underestimate, particularly myself. I grew up playing games pretty much alone. I didn't really have friends who were into video games as much as I did, or was at least. And the I think it's a really huge level, and it sounds kind of stupid because it's part of the name almost, but really the social aspect of it is just really incalculable. The fact that you're not just playing a game with other people. A lot of times, especially with MMOs and people that devote a lot of time to it, they really build legitimate relationships and
Right.
friendships. Some people meet their spouses that way, and a lot of people kind of make fun of that. But I really do believe there's a lot. I mean, in so much as it's kind of more involved with social media actually to a level. It's tons of ways to connect with people and learn about them, and then you get to do something with them too. You already have an automatic shared hobby. And I think it's not just a like you're playing a game with someone, or like it's not this kind of immersion based thing. It's actually like it's not like you're trying to get out of reality. You're kind of creating your own new reality with other people, and it's not just like I said, a completely avoidant thing, because you are interacting with other people, and you're doing it together. And I think that's a hugely powerful force, that keeps people coming back and sticking with what we see from this kind of dispassionate, like logical, mechanical standpoint is maybe inferior
Right.
game right play or game design. Um, yeah, it's impossible. I mean, humans are so social; it's impossible to underestimate. If that is a core mechanic of the game and done well, then that'll keep you coming back to a shitty game over and over. Not saying WoW was a shitty game, by the way. That was way too harsh. I think it's a masterpiece in a lot of ways.
If you
But
do the social aspect really well, you can get people to play a game just for that. Like, Facebook is not that interesting
yeah,
of a game, but people go there all the time,
yeah,
right?
right. In terms of mechanics of Facebook, and like I said, it's the shared thing to talk about. Like even the frustration of say like a big content gap in WoW, or like a grind, right? You get to share that with other people, and people love getting to
Yeah.
bond over shared frustrations, and you get to work off that, and even maybe try to problem solve together about that. That's just a hugely powerful bonding thing. Problem solving, adversity, that sort of thing. These kind of really basic human themes that get displayed really well, maybe even unintentionally in games, um, like MMOs. But that's a huge part. It's the other thing is that as far as I know, again, this might be just some selection bias here on my part, but that is something you see a lot of. It's pretty easy to read about, to find really great stories about that in WoW, World of Warcraft. You tend to not see that quite as much in Eve, right? Like the sandbox is way more brutal.
Right.
It's quite Darwinian actually. You don't have like friendships as much because it's all this like
Intrigue.
power play, almost sociopathy intrigue, right? And that's the part of the game. That's why the game works so well, um, because you're all playing against each other, and so it's really hard to form like really true friendships,
Right.
as far as I can tell, in Eve. That might be oversimplified, um, but I think it is easier in a game that does foster cooperation as opposed to conflict and competition. Um,
Well, and
so makes sense why it'd be a lot easier to get in a fun community in World of Warcraft than someone looking for social stuff in uh, Eve. Is probably not. It's not going to go well. You're going to trust someone. They're going to take advantage of you immediately, and you're going to lose everything and start over, or just
right,
log off
yeah,
and
I
never
think
come
that
back.
that's and you end up with these groups of people who have a common goal for the time being, but alliances shift, like the story you told, where there was probably big money in that guy who defected, like,
Totally.
or something important, maybe a position in
Yeah.
the corporation. Um,
And that's the other thing, is that I'm pretty sure. I mean, like real relationships were probably lost there, right? Like he probably had to have some semblance of working relationship with all of his. I mean, he was really high up in that corporation. Like I said, this game's super involved, and he probably really made legitimate real life enemies.
Yeah, people, I would.
Like.
It's one of the ways intense. That theme parks can add content, I already mentioned like the difficulty of the PvE and the way to scale that, is to add a PvP mode, and that allows them to take on some of the sandbox characteristics. There's different types of PvP that you can go to. You can go to, combat is kind of the one that people think of, but you also can do a map control, and you mentioned Warhammer Online. PlanetSide does this too, where you fight over very specific points on the map. I think World of Warcraft actually does this in some zones, where you try to take map control at a high level. Or you can do an economy PvP, which EVE does have combat PvP, but it's the real PvP is in the economy. And AI trying to amass ISK.
Yeah, it seems like.
So I do think that there's room for theme parks to steal some interesting sandbox type things when you have players fighting each other, competing with each other to generate their own content in a way. You put the players to work for you because you cannot keep up with the demand to just be fed content. And in a weird way, this is kind of like crowdsourcing content, but it's doing what MMOs want to do naturally, which is to have players interact and to have those interactions be an important part of the game. Like grinding out, raptor kills is not that important in Stranglethorn Vale, but if I'm with 3 of my buddies, it might be something we talk about.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, that goes back to the themes we've talked about many a time, right? Like going back to the idea of emergent gameplay that is inherent to multiplayer tends to be the most successful, right? Like it seems to be the most compelling, seems to be the most fun. It's why Minecraft has succeeded so well, right? We talked about the meta in Super Smash Bros. Melee and how that's changed and kept people interested in a game that's is that 15 years old now? When did that come out? 2002? 2001? The point is, I think it does kind of come back to that over and over, is that these social ability to make that happen will trump a whole lot of these tentacle design things that we seem to be able to come up with. If you can make that work, then your game takes off. And that's like the thing too that we talked about a little bit. We can close kind of talking about this, which was trying to figure out what exactly it is outside of subscription based fees. That makes sense. You want players to stick around because they're actually paying money to you. That's a huge cash cow. But past that, there is this draw, right, to particularly MMOs. You kind of were talking about players as a resource almost that developers think of, right? Like keeping players.
Yeah, player retention. Sure I think I see this in a lot of games. It's not just MMOs. People talk about replay value. Any conversation you hear about replay value, or just wanting to keep players around, basically. Yeah. And it does feel like players are this thing that game creators squabble over, not just to get sales. Like I get that, of course. The economy is inherently PvP. Yeah, exactly. That's the real world PvP, right?
Right. Yeah. Right. there's some like double meta right there that we just hit. We just how many metas does it take towards reality? I don't know.
But so I get that. But once the player is already playing the game, it feels like there's this need for the developer or the game studio to keep the player kind of in their camp. And me and Greg were just having a conversation about what is it that that game developers really get out of having a player playing their game if it's not that they're paying for something.
And that's and so there's like a few obvious ones, which is like I talk about just word of mouth is a big part of it. Again, if you're doing just purely from a financial standpoint, that if you have more people who are happily playing your game, even if they're not paying, they're more likely to talk to their friends about it and review it well. And that's how big movements grow, right? It's word of mouth. That's the best way to do that. So that makes tons of sense. But past that, we were talking about again to beat a dead horse a little bit, but back to Diablo 3 or even like Overwatch, right? The Blizzard games, or RTSs, right? Something past that. Which they're not big anymore, so I can't give you a relevant example other than StarCraft, which is another Blizzard game.
Crap.
But anyway, point is, there's large, Planetary Annihilation. Yeah, that's one that'll resonate with 3 people. Not even listening, like total, like across the world. No, I like that game a lot. Anyway, point is, there's huge quote unquote content gaps, right? That you don't think of. You don't think of those as such in anything but an MMO, but those exist all over the place. But people still want your, if it's just a game that you buy once, then again, from this purely business economical standpoint, you don't give a crap what happens after that. You got your money out of that project and you go on to the next one. And in a most cynical world, right, you see that with some of the games that get pumped out every 6 months, like Assassin's Creed or the Ubisoft games in large part. They don't care too much about quality, and people keep on buying them. So heck yeah, keep on doing it. But that's probably not the norm in general across. People want player retention. They want you to keep on playing their game, and that's a weird thing. It really is. I couldn't, outside of, like I said, word of mouth, keeping you invested in the company itself, so that you'll buy their next game. Which that gets dicey though when you're pushing out new and free content, which you could be spending on the next game. You could be spending developer time to do that, and resources, and then again. So there may be some level of I think there is another level of kind of a human level of developer. A lot of developers are really passionate about what they do and really love it and care a lot about the games they put out and want to want to make it as good as they can. The cynical side of me says that wouldn't probably be driving these big macro level choices about game lifespan.
Well, in case anybody lost us as we took this jump to player retention, there is I think MMOs are notorious for this. First of all, they're socially sort of sticky because people create so many social connections that don't translate quickly to another game. But also developers, even at their own cost, go through great lengths to try to keep people in that world. And sometimes it doesn't seem like there's much incentive for them to do that. In a sandbox, the developers don't have to keep adding content. The players actually will retain each other, and I think it feels a bit more natural. In a theme park, there is some social retention that happens because you have friends there, but I think the game it doesn't fit as naturally with that.
Basically, in large part, it makes it there's a natural sense of retention regardless of the amount of content in the sandbox because it's not dependent on the developer content, and that's the game. That's going to happen naturally in a theme park. It's a lot harder to do that because outside of, again, like I said, maybe we're underestimating a little bit just the social dynamic there. But past that, I also believe there is some level of, no matter how powerful that is, you also can't, that won't last forever, basically, and that's got to gradually weaken. So it has to be something that brings people back, and that's not that's not going to be something that's easily doable, and yet it is kind of the goal. So
yeah,
I think it's a weird thing, and I wonder if like game developers think about that outside, like why we're doing that. I mean, it's just kind of the go-to, right? Like intrinsically that makes sense, right? Like, no, we want as many people playing our game as possible indefinitely because that makes sense. We're game developers and games are made to be played, and we want people to play the game. Like that's good. That's got to be good. But thinking about it, like I said, outside of just a pure business perspective, it's a weird thing, particularly with MMOs, of that retention. Like I said, again, the sub from the subscriber fee, which is also fascinating, right? There's this sunk cost thing with subs. So you buy a game for $60, you play it for a bit, but then it's not costing you anything else to play it or to not play it. So if you're not playing it, it doesn't feel bad. If you buy a subscription-based thing that is going to run out, and that you already spent $15 and you play for a few days at the beginning of the month and then decide you don't really want to, you're so much more likely to come back. Kind of that sunk cost fallacy. It's so much easier to come back into that because of that sunk cost and feeling kind of this obligation to yourself even to make good on your investment.
Right. You invested in the game, and so you need to get the appropriate amount of time out of it.
Right. Right. Which is also this weird, I don't know, it's a very odd thing, man, when you think about it. There's a lot of psychologically, there's a whole lot of just manipulation. keep people in, which I guess is just almost any business. But
so players have shown pretty clearly that they're willing to pay more money for incremental content than they are for just a brand new game, right?
Totally, yeah. It's way harder to drop $60 than $1 60 times.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you're paying $15 a month, you don't realize you bought a full retail game after 4 months of WoW.
Right.
You're just happy that they released a new raid. And
Right.
if you don't
Right.
actually sit back and do the math, you don't realize that that's not a really great deal. Um, and so I can see why developers would want to retain players, if they can keep selling them incremental content. Um,
Totally. Totally.
But unfortunately, uh, for the developers, a lot of content is not monetized. And so
Yeah.
instead, in these theme parks, you get an expanding world. They tack things on narratively. Maybe they even open up new zones. But the
Right.
game, it evolves, but I think it's very hard to keep a sense of cohesiveness and a real vision for what the game is, as it
Yeah.
evolves,
Yeah.
because
Very much.
you're introducing new things, and you're sort of focusing on getting out that next step without thinking of all the steps that came from before it, or the base that you're building on.
Totally. That brings me back to real briefly narrative, which is it's impossible to make any lasting change as a player on the world, right? Because you need that world to be existing still for other people to level through.
Right.
So and some phasing technology has helped with that, but in large part it's really. I mean, WoW is actually notorious for this in terms of as you level, it's almost incoherent because you kind of go back and forth through different time zones because they like redid certain leveling experiences and other ones. So the narrative doesn't even make any sense. Much less if you like go to like capital city, a big social hub, right? That is always in like current day, quote unquote, as opposed to like if you're playing through vanilla. Well, you don't even have vanilla anymore. They updated that, so it's weird. You have anyway. It's a long story. It's a really muddled timeline, basically, and there's nothing you can do about. Basically, there was a big, huge thing. They tried to revamp the whole level 1 to 60, which used to be the original vanilla experience. They tried to revamp that 3 expansions in, and they succeeded. And the problem with that was that it was a lot of people were pissed about it actually because it removed quote unquote a whole lot of content. You didn't have the vanilla leveling anymore. But two, it was extremely it was extremely difficult to get people to like connect with it because it was something entirely different, and it's very difficult if you've been playing a character for so long. Suddenly, the world has changed around you, and the only way to experience it is to go back and start a new one. Like it doesn't make it was very difficult, and it was this thing which it sounded really like I don't know. It sounded very noble in some ways, or very ambitious, and didn't work. I think in large part because of just the MMO structure. You can't do something. You can't change the world. Basically, stuff can't really change. You can only add stuff on, and that's a really hard way to. That's not the way the real world works, right? Like stuff changes. You don't just keep on finding new areas of the world. It's not like when you're done. It's not like when you've like seen all of Europe, you can't go back to Europe again, or like nothing more can happen in Europe. Like you can only do the same stuff
Yeah,
in Europe.
exactly. How
It's like not
ridiculous
how
would
that
that be?
works. And you have to go east. You know, and it's basically the way MMOs work as of now. So
Yeah,
again, just a final note there
and there are some
on
cool
my
games
narrative
in this
gripes.
space. Um, Ashes of Creation is a game that's going to be coming out soon, and I'm really curious to see the way that it shakes some of this up. It has zone control that we talked about, sort of built throughout the game. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it has a caravan system that runs between towns that people can sabotage, um, and
Yeah,
and
something Arcade did too.
and that's a way to encourage player interaction. I think just in general, and a theme, I guess probably for this whole podcast, is games really excel when they have a sense of unification, and I think that sandboxes, I guess, to join in the sandbox versus theme park debate, I think sandbox. I think the MMOs are really augmented and benefit when you let the players be the players in the world. You make the world, and you don't try to force them into a specific narrative or a specific track to go through, because it feels like that pushes against the community, make our own world, do our own society that you're sort of creating in an MMO inherently. Because socially, it is anarchical, I guess. There are no rules socially. You kind of get that sense of having reset everything, um, And there's just too many problems associated with trying to make everybody the hero. When everybody's the hero, nobody is.
Right, right. Yeah. The only time that works, actually, I have another friend. We were going back and forth. Like when everyone can play guitar, no one can. Like that doesn't make sense. Like it's the only place that works is when everyone is special, no one is. It's a really weird little niche thing. Anyway, but no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the other weird thing is that like sandboxes are totally self-modulating, right? Like the only ones that work are the ones that are gonna succeed at that, right? Like you can have a good developer who can make a really good theme park MMO and it's just gonna be really good and people are probably gonna respond to that. But if a sandbox doesn't come together as a community,
Right.
it's gonna fail. And if it doesn't deliver that type of content, that's probably why you see so fewer of those than theme parks. But the ones that do succeed, you also know, are going to be good. They have to be, otherwise they wouldn't be able to continue to
Right.
exist because they're so dependent on player interaction and freedom and
They
creativity.
are self-sustaining. Because once you get people
Yeah, yeah,
involved with your world and you've given them enough freedom to be creative in the confines of that universe, then there's so many possibilities. I mean, it's not unlike what we have in literature. There are certain rules about how to do a given genre, and people work in those confines. And we've been writing books for a very long time, um, and so
yeah,
it's much more bang for your buck, I would say, as a player. It's way easier as a
yeah,
developer
totally.
to set up rules and to let people do what they want. Of course, it's difficult to get the rules right and to get all that tuning right. But once you do it, I think the world just makes sense more. Like to be
Mm-hmm.
a guy traveling the world, traveling the universe in Eve, who's some rando trying to ascend the ranks of a corporation. That's what you're doing in Eve, and that's what you're doing actually. You are actually
Yeah,
some
that's what you are
random
actually,
person
right?
that nobody knows.
Yeah, trying to make it in a pretty cutthroat game. Yeah, the reality and the game actually line up pretty well.
And in a game like where you're supposed to be this badass hero, who in a couple of weeks will discover that when you finally hit level 60 or 70 or 80, like that is not actually what's happening. Like you'll be just as
Right,
obscure as a
exactly.
top level player as you were as a low level player, even
Yeah,
though the
yeah,
narrative
precisely.
will tell you you're becoming more heroic.
Yeah, yeah, it's very difficult. You're right. There's a big disconnect there. It's really difficult to sell. Well, I could certainly talk about narrative and storytelling forever, but I think we're coming to a close here. I think this actually goes in slightly well to what our plan for next week, which is going to be we have a few things actually in the works. A few one longer project that we're hoping to probably get done and unveil a little bit later. Um, that will be something new, but past that, next week we're going to talk about and I swear this is going to be way more interesting than it sounds, but
Yes.
marketplaces. Kind of precisely what we were talking about in terms of in-game economies that MMOs kind of thrive on. Eve is, like we said, kind of primarily an economy-based game, but it's a really interesting topic when it comes to the way that one, how you set that up in a game and make that gameplay as opposed to just actual financial stuff. One, two, and how well that mirrors reality and what we can learn from that. So I think that's where we're going for next week. Thank you guys so much for listening. Seriously, Mark and I love doing this, so the idea that other people might enjoy listening is super cool for us too. Feel free to drop us any semblance of line on Facebook or via those email addresses that we have up. Greg or Mark at
.net.
gamingmechanics.com. .net. Yep, that's important. And because yeah, as we were saying, the social aspect, this is the fun stuff. So if we're totally off base, please tell us. And if there's stuff that you agree with, let us know too. I think that's all we got for you today, Mark. Anything else from you?
Nope. I think that's a good place to stop.
Sweet. Well, see you guys next time, hopefully next week. And for now, this is Greg and Mark signing off.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.